They forced him to marry a monster, and by nightfall, he was the only man in that town who didn't run. The dust hadn't even settled when they dragged Ethan Caldwell to the center of Red Hollow, boots scraping against dry earth, the sun hanging low like it wanted no part in what was about to happen. Men stood in a half-circle, hats tilted, eyes sharp with that quiet kind of cruelty that doesn't need shouting. Someone laughed. Someone spat. And in the middle of it all stood the woman they called a monster. Nakoma didn't move. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't answer the names they threw at her like stones without weight. She just stood there, tall and still, the wind tugging lightly at the edge of her dress, dark hair resting against her shoulders like it belonged to the land itself. Ethan followed their stares, and for a moment, he didn't see what they saw. He saw someone steady, someone waiting. But that wasn't the story the town had already agreed on. "Go on," the sheriff said, voice flat as old wood, pushing the paper into Ethan's hands. "Sign it." It wasn't a request. Nothing about this day had been. Ethan looked down at the ink, at the space where his name was supposed to surrender something he hadn't even been allowed to keep. A man near the saloon door muttered, "Won't last the night." Another answered, "I'll give him an hour." The laughter came low, like they were sharing a joke that only worked if someone else paid the price. Ethan didn't laugh. His jaw tightened, fingers curling just slightly around the pen before pressing it down. The scratch of ink on paper sounded louder than it should have. Final.
Permanent. Done.
The ceremony, if it could be called that, lasted less than a minute. No music.
No blessing.
Just a nod from the sheriff, and a silence that felt heavier than words. Nakoma stepped forward when it was over, not close, not far, just enough to exist beside him without asking permission. She didn't reach for his hand, didn't speak. The crowd waited for something, a reaction, a crack, a sign that this was already breaking him. Ethan didn't give them that either. He just stood there, shoulders squared, eyes drifting once more toward the woman he was now tied to. The stories said she was dangerous. Said men disappeared around her. Said she didn't belong among people who built things instead of wandering through them. But stories had a way of growing teeth where there were none. And standing there, under a sky turning amber with evening, Ethan felt something else entirely. Not fear. Not yet. Something quieter. Something unfinished. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched long across the ground. And one by one, the townsfolk stepped back, already certain they'd seen how this would end. They always were. But they didn't follow him when he turned toward the small cabin at the edge of town. They didn't watch closely enough to see that Nakoma didn't walk behind him like a burden. She walked beside him. And neither of them said a word as the door closed behind them. The cabin was smaller than it looked from the outside, built from rough pine that had long since surrendered its scent to years of dust and sun, a single window catching the last light of evening as it stretched across the floor in thin, fading lines. Ethan stepped in first, his boots pausing just past the threshold, as if something unseen had drawn a line he was not yet ready to cross. Behind him, the door closed with a soft, final sound that seemed louder in the silence that followed. Nakoma remained near the entrance for a moment, not waiting for permission, not asking for space, simply allowing the quiet to settle the way it needed to. The air inside carried the faint smell of dry wood and something else, something cleaner, like water recently drawn and left to rest. Ethan glanced around, expecting disorder, something that matched the stories he had heard whispered through the town like warnings passed between men who had never once stepped inside this place. But nothing here felt wild. Nothing felt out of control. A small table stood near the wall, a tin cup resting beside a clay pitcher. A folded blanket lay neatly across a narrow bed, its edges aligned with care that did not belong to chaos. He shifted his weight, eyes narrowing slightly, as if the room itself had just contradicted everything he thought he knew. Nakoma moved then, slow and deliberate, stepping past him without brushing against his shoulder, her presence measured in inches rather than force. She crossed to the table, lifting the pitcher and pouring water into the cup with steady hands that did not tremble, did not rush. The sound of water filling metal echoed softly, the only voice in the room. She set the cup down where he could reach it, then stepped back again, placing distance between them as naturally as breathing. No words followed.
No explanation.
Ethan watched her, waiting for something else, something that would match the fear the town had painted so clearly in his mind. But she did not move toward him. She did not demand anything. She simply existed, quiet and composed, as if she had done this before, as if she had stood in rooms like this with men who had already decided who she was before they ever saw her. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to notice it had been there at all. His eyes drifted toward the door. It was still closed but not locked. The latch hung loose, easy to lift. Outside, the last light of day was fading into deep blue, and somewhere in the distance, a horse shifted its weight, the faint sound carrying through the open spaces beyond the cabin walls. He could leave. No one stood outside waiting to stop him. No voice called his name. No chain held him in place. The town had already decided he would run. That was the ending they understood. His gaze returned to Nakoma. She had turned slightly, her back angled toward him now, not in dismissal, but in trust, as if she had chosen not to watch what he would do next. And in that quiet gesture, something shifted. Not in the room, but in him. Because monsters did not turn their backs. Monsters did not leave doors open. And yet here she stood, offering him both without a word. Ethan took a step toward the door, his hand rising halfway before stopping in the air, caught between what was expected and what was true. The silence stretched, long and unbroken, holding the weight of a choice that no one else would ever fully see. And still, neither of them spoke. His hand stayed there, hovering inches from the latch, fingers slightly curled as if they had forgotten how to finish the motion they had already begun. The wood of the door was worn smooth where years of hands had pushed it open and closed, a simple path out of something complicated. Ethan could feel the cool night air seeping through the cracks, brushing against his knuckles like a quiet invitation. Behind him, the room did not change. No movement. No sound. Nakoma did not turn to look. She did not ask him to stay. She did not ask him anything at all. And that was the part that unsettled him the most. He lowered his hand slowly, not all at once, but in pieces, like something inside him needed time to understand the choice before it could accept it. The silence pressed in again, heavier now, filled with everything neither of them had said. He turned away from the door, just enough to let his eyes find her again. She had moved only slightly, now kneeling near the far wall, her hands working with quiet precision over something he had not noticed before. A small bundle of cloth lay open beside her, and from it she took a strip of fabric, folding it once, then again, as if preparing it for a purpose that required care more than speed. There was a mark along her forearm, not fresh, not hidden, just there, part of her like the rest of her strength. She wrapped the cloth around it with steady fingers, tightening it just enough to hold, then tying it off with a knot that spoke of habit rather than urgency. Ethan watched without meaning to, the pieces of her story beginning to shift in his mind, not through words, but through what she did when no one was asking her to explain. Monsters did not tend to themselves quietly. Monsters did not carry their pain like it was something to manage instead of something to spread. He took a step back into the room, the floor creaking softly under his weight, and this time she did not turn because she had already heard him choose. Not with words. Not with a declaration. But with the absence of a door opening behind him. He moved toward the table, his hand brushing against the tin cup she had left for him. The water inside had settled, its surface still and clear, reflecting the faint glow of the lantern that hung unlit near the wall. He picked it up, hesitating for a fraction of a second before taking a slow drink. It was cool.
Clean. Real.
He set it back down exactly where it had been, something about that small act feeling larger than it should have. Nakoma finished tying the cloth and rose to her feet, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge the space they now shared differently. She crossed the room again, her steps measured, and reached for something near the bed. When she turned this time, there was an object in her hand.
A knife.
Simple.
Worn.
Its handle smooth from years of use, its edge catching the last thread of light slipping through the window. She held it out, not pointed, not offered with threat, but extended between them with the same calm certainty she had shown in everything else. "If you want to leave," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying no anger, no fear, only truth shaped into sound. "Do it clean." The words settled into the room like dust, quiet but impossible to ignore. Ethan did not reach for the knife. He did not step back either. He simply looked at it, then at her, and in that moment, the stories he had been given lost something they could not get back. Because nothing about this felt like a trap, and nothing about her felt like something meant to be escaped. The knife stayed between them, suspended in a space that did not belong to either of them alone, its weight measured not in steel but in what it meant to offer it without hesitation. Ethan's eyes lingered on the worn handle, then lifted slowly to meet Nakoma's gaze, and for the first time since the sun had started to fall, there was no distance in the way she looked at him, no guarded edge, just something steady and unafraid of what he might decide. He exhaled through his nose, a quiet breath that carried more thought than words ever could, and shook his head once, not sharply, not in rejection, but in something closer to understanding. His hand rose halfway, then shifted past the knife, gently pushing it back toward her without touching the blade, without turning the moment into something it was not. She did not resist. She simply lowered it, the motion smooth, practiced, as if she had already expected that answer long before he gave it. The air in the cabin seemed to change then, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like something unspoken had settled into place where it belonged. Nakoma turned away again, returning the knife to its place near the bed, sliding it beneath the folded blanket with care that suggested it was a tool before it was anything else. Ethan watched her for a second longer before his attention drifted, drawn by something he had missed before, something small resting on the edge of the table near the wall. It was a piece of leather, worn thin at the edges, stitched with careful hands into a narrow band that had been repaired more than once. He stepped closer, his boots slow against the wooden floor, and reached for it without thinking. It was lighter than it looked, the surface marked with faint patterns that had faded over time, but not disappeared. There was a story in it, one that had been carried, not displayed. He turned it slightly in his fingers, and that was when he saw the thread. Not just any thread, but a different color woven into the repairs, newer than the rest, stronger, holding the older pieces together where they might have fallen apart. He glanced toward Nakoma, who had paused just enough to notice what he held, her expression unchanged but her stillness more deliberate now, like she was choosing whether to explain or let the silence do it for her. Ethan did not ask. He did not need to. He set the band back where he had found it, careful to place it exactly as it had been, respecting something he did not yet fully understand but knew mattered. The lantern by the wall caught his eye next, its glass clean, wick trimmed, ready to be lit but left dark for now, as if the room had learned to wait for light instead of forcing it. Nakoma crossed the space once more, stopping a few feet from him, close enough to share the same quiet, far enough to keep it intact. "You do not have to stay," she said, her voice even, carrying no expectation, no plea, just the truth as she saw it. "No one here belongs to anyone." The words settled between them, different from what he had heard all day, different from the voices that had tried to decide for him before he ever stepped into this room. Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, past the stories, past the label that had followed her like a shadow through every street in that town. He saw the way she stood, not defensive, not submissive, just present. He saw the way her hands rested at her sides, ready, but not tense. He saw someone who had been called something she was not for so long that she no longer bothered to argue with it. His gaze drifted once more toward the door, then back to her, and this time there was no hesitation in the way he stood. He did not move toward the latch. He did not reach for the knife. He simply stepped back, farther into the room, placing himself on the side of the choice that did not need words to prove it had been made. The room settled into a deeper quiet as the last light slipped away from the window, leaving only the faint outline of shapes and the slow rhythm of two people learning how to exist in the same space without forcing it. Ethan moved toward the lantern, his fingers brushing the metal frame before lifting it slightly to check the wick, a small, practical motion that gave his hands something to do while his thoughts caught up with everything that had shifted in the past hour. He struck a match against the side of the table, the soft flare of light filling the space between them for just a second before the flame steadied and touched the wick. The lantern came alive with a warm glow, pushing back the shadows without chasing them away completely, leaving corners dim and honest. Nakoma watched the light for a moment, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging it as part of the room now, like the rest of it. She moved to the far side of the cabin and knelt beside a wooden chest that had been tucked near the wall, its surface marked by years of use, but kept clean with the same care as everything else. She opened it quietly and reached inside, pulling out another blanket, thicker than the one on the bed, its edges worn but strong. She laid it on the floor near the opposite wall, smoothing it flat with her hands, pressing down the corners so it would not shift in the night. Ethan noticed the distance she chose, not too far to feel like exile, not too close to feel like a claim. Just enough to make it clear that space here was not taken, it was given. He leaned back against the table for a second, watching her movements, the way each action had purpose without urgency, like she had long ago learned that rushing did not make things better, only louder. "You always keep it this way?" he asked, his voice low, not demanding an answer, just testing whether words had a place in this room at all. Nakoma glanced up briefly, her eyes catching the lantern light before settling again. "Quiet keeps things clear," she said, her tone even, as if the answer had been waiting long before the question. Ethan let that sit for a moment, nodding slightly even though she had already returned to adjusting the blanket, her attention moving back to the small details that made the space livable instead of just occupied. He pushed himself off the table and stepped toward the bed, not sitting right away, just standing beside it, taking in the way it had been prepared, the edges straight, the surface undisturbed, as if it had been waiting for someone who might never arrive. He ran a hand along the top of the blanket, feeling the texture, the weight of something made to last rather than impress. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the walls in a low, steady sound that reminded him how far they were from anything that could interfere with what happened inside this cabin.
No voices. No judgment.
No one watching to see if he would fail. He sat down slowly, the bed creaking under his weight, the sound breaking the quiet for just a moment before settling again. Nakoma did not look up this time. She had finished with her side of the room and now sat back on her heels, her posture relaxed but alert, like someone who rested without ever letting go completely. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze dropping to the floor between them, the space marked by the lantern light and the shadow it cast behind him. "They think they know you," he said after a while, the words coming out softer than he expected. Nakoma did not answer right away. She looked at him then, not sharply, not defensively, just directly. "They think they need to," she replied, her voice steady, carrying no bitterness, only a quiet certainty that did not ask to be challenged. Ethan let out a breath that almost turned into a laugh but did not quite make it, shaking his head slightly as if something inside him had just been proven wrong in a way that could not be argued with. He leaned back, the tension in his shoulders easing another inch, the room no longer feeling like something he had to escape from, but something he had stepped into by choice. The lantern flickered once, then steadied again, its light holding firm as the night outside grew deeper, and inside, neither of them moved to disturb the silence that had finally begun to feel like it belonged to them both. The lantern flame steadied into a quiet glow, its light stretching across the wooden floor in soft lines that shifted with every small movement in the room, and Ethan found himself watching that light more than anything else, as if it was easier to understand than the silence sitting between them. Outside, the wind moved through the open land in long, low breaths, brushing against the cabin walls like something that had been there long before either of them arrived, and would remain long after. Nakoma shifted slightly on the blanket she had laid out, not to draw attention, but to settle into a position that spoke of rest without surrender, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed in a way that came from knowing her place did not need defending here. Ethan leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, his gaze drifting toward her before pulling away, not out of discomfort, but because he was beginning to understand that looking too long might break something that had taken all evening to form. "You knew they would do that," he said after a while, his voice quiet, shaped more by thought than accusation. Nakoma did not answer immediately. She reached beside her, picking up a small piece of wood that had been resting near the edge of the blanket, turning it slowly between her fingers as if the motion helped organize something deeper than words. "People act the same when they are afraid," she said finally, her tone even, her eyes not on him, but somewhere just past the lantern light. "They name things before they understand them." Ethan let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening just slightly at the truth of it, not because it surprised him, but because it fit too well with everything he had seen in Red Hollow and never questioned until now. He shifted his weight, leaning back against the edge of the bed, one hand resting on the wood beside him, grounding himself in something solid while his thoughts moved through unfamiliar ground. "And you let them," he said, not harshly, just trying to follow the path she had laid out. Nakoma's lips curved almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, not quite anything that could be named, but something that carried its own kind of certainty. "Letting them believe does not make it true," she replied, her voice steady, as if the idea had been tested more times than it needed to be explained. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but firm, like the foundation of something that did not need to be seen to hold weight. Ethan nodded once, his eyes dropping to the floor again, tracing the edge of the lantern light where it met the darker wood, the boundary clear but not harsh. He thought about the men in town, the way they had spoken, the ease with which they had reduced her to something simple, something easy to dismiss. He had stood among them. He had heard it all. And, until tonight, he had not questioned it. The realization did not come with guilt as much as it came with clarity, a shift in how he saw things that could not be undone once it had begun. Nakoma set the piece of wood down beside her, her hands coming to rest loosely in her lap, her posture unchanged but her presence now anchored in the same quiet understanding that had taken shape in the room. She glanced toward the door for a brief moment, not with concern, but with awareness, as if measuring the distance between what was outside and what had been built inside these walls in just a few hours.
Ethan
Followed her gaze, his eyes resting on the closed latch, the simple piece of metal that now felt less like an exit and more like a line he had already crossed. He leaned back further, letting his shoulders rest against the wall, the tension that had followed him from the town slowly unwinding, replaced by something steadier, something he could not yet name but did not feel the need to question. The lantern flickered once more, then held, its light unwavering as the night deepened around them, and in that quiet, with no one watching and nothing left to prove, Ethan Caldwell understood that staying had not been a moment of hesitation. It had been the first honest choice he had made all day. The night stretched deeper, settling over the land like a quiet agreement that nothing more needed to be said, and inside the cabin, the lantern burned low but steady, its glow soft enough to leave space for shadows without letting them take over. Ethan had not moved much, but something about the way he sat had changed, less guarded, less ready to leave, as if the weight of expectation had finally slipped off his shoulders without him noticing when it happened. Nakoma remained where she was, her presence as constant as the walls themselves, not demanding attention, not fading into the background, just there in a way that made the room feel balanced instead of divided. The wind outside shifted direction, brushing along the side of the cabin in a slow, deliberate pass, and for a moment, it carried a faint sound from far off, something like a loose shutter or a distant horse stepping in dry grass. Ethan tilted his head slightly, listening, then let it go when nothing followed. "They will be waiting in the morning," he said after a while, his voice low, almost thoughtful, as if he was speaking more to the idea than to her. Nakoma did not look toward the door this time. She already knew what he meant. "They always wait," she replied, her tone calm, shaped by experience rather than concern. Ethan nodded once, his eyes drifting toward the lantern, watching the flame bend slightly with the movement of air inside the room. He thought about the faces in town, the way they leaned forward. When something did not belong, the way they fed on certainty even when it was built on nothing real. He had been one of them without realizing it. That thought did not sit heavily on him now. It simply existed, like something that had already passed and could not be returned to. He shifted his position, leaning back fully against the wall this time, stretching his legs slightly, allowing himself to settle in a way he had not expected to when the door first closed behind him. Across the room, Nakoma adjusted the edge of her blanket once more, a small movement that suggested she was preparing for the night, not as an end, but as something that would pass like any other. Ethan watched her for a second, then looked away, not out of discomfort, but out of respect for the quiet she had given him without asking for anything in return. "You could have left," he said, the words coming without much thought, but carrying more weight than he intended. Nakoma paused, her hand resting lightly on the blanket before she answered. "So could you," she said, her voice even, not challenging, just placing the truth where it belonged. Ethan let out a small breath, something close to a quiet acknowledgement, and nodded again, his gaze lowering to the floor between them, the space that had once felt uncertain now holding something steadier, something that did not need to be named to be understood. The lantern flickered once, then steadied, its light casting long, soft shadows that moved slowly with the rhythm of the flame. Time passed without measure, not marked by words or actions, but by the way the room settled further into itself, the way the distance between them no longer felt like something that needed to be crossed. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to listen, to the wind, to the quiet, to the absence of everything that had filled his day before this. When he opened them again, nothing had changed, and that was the point. Nakoma had already lowered herself onto the blanket, resting on her side, her posture relaxed but aware, as if she trusted the space without surrendering to it completely. Ethan remained where he was, not reaching for the bed, not moving toward the door, simply staying where he had chosen to be. Outside, the night held its ground, wide and unbroken, and inside, without any witness and without any need for one, the decision he had made continued to hold, quiet and firm, like something that would still be there when the morning came. The night did not break all at once. It loosened slowly, like a grip easing its hold, and sometime between one breath and the next, the darkness outside the window began to soften into a faint gray that carried the promise of morning without announcing it. Ethan had not meant to fall asleep, but the kind of rest that comes without planning had found him anyway, his back still against the wall, his head tilted slightly forward, the tension that once lived in his shoulders now replaced by something quieter, something steady. He woke without a start, without confusion, just a slow return to awareness, his eyes opening to the dim outline of the cabin as it shifted from night into early light. The lantern had burned low, its flame barely holding on, casting a thin glow that no longer led the room but simply remained as a witness to what had passed. Across from him, Nakoma was already awake. She had not moved much, but her posture had changed, sitting upright on the blanket, her gaze directed toward the window where the first line of dawn stretched across the horizon. She did not turn when he stirred. She had already heard him. Ethan straightened slowly, pressing his hands against his knees as he pushed himself up, the wood beneath him creaking softly, the sound carrying in the quiet like a signal that the night had ended without anything breaking. He glanced toward the door, almost out of habit, then away again, the thought of leaving no longer carrying the same weight it had just hours before. Outside, a faint movement could be heard, distant but deliberate, the kind of sound that came from people who had risen early for a reason. He knew what it was without needing to step outside to confirm it. They had come back. Nakoma stood then, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if the morning belonged to her the same way the night had. She crossed the room and reached for the pitcher, pouring fresh water into the same tin cup, placing it on the table in the exact spot where it had rested before, the gesture unchanged, steady, consistent, like something that did not shift with the opinions of others. Ethan watched her, not with surprise anymore, but with recognition, as if the pattern of her actions had already become familiar in a way that made sense to him now. "They are outside," he said quietly, his voice carrying no urgency, only acknowledgement. Nakoma nodded once, her eyes still on the cup for a moment, before lifting toward him. "Yes," she replied, as if the presence of the town was no more unexpected than the rising sun. Ethan stepped toward the door this time, his boots slow but certain against the wooden floor, each step measured, not because he was unsure, but because he understood what waited on the other side. He reached for the latch, his hand resting on it for just a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. Behind him, Nakoma did not follow. She did not stand close. She did not place herself between him and the world outside. She remained where she was, giving him the same thing she had given him all night.
The choice.
Ethan lifted the latch and opened the door, the morning air spilling into the cabin, cool and clean, carrying with it the low murmur of voices gathered just beyond the threshold. He stepped out into the light, the sun just beginning to rise over the edge of the land, casting long shadows across the ground where the townspeople had gathered, their eyes fixed on him with the kind of expectation that had been building since the night before. Some leaned forward. Some crossed their arms. All of them waited for the same thing.
For him to prove them right.
Ethan stood there for a moment, the light catching the edge of his face, his posture steady, his gaze moving slowly across the crowd before settling into something calm, something unshaken. He did not look back inside. He did not call her name. He did not explain, because nothing that mattered needed explaining anymore. And behind him, the door remained open, not as an escape, but as a truth they had not expected to see. No one spoke at first, not because they did not have words, but because whatever they had expected to see was not standing in front of them. The morning light stretched across the dirt road, catching on boots, on belt buckles, on faces that had come prepared to laugh, or shake their heads, or confirm something they had already decided the night before. Ethan Caldwell did not give them that. He stood there, still as the fence posts lining the edge of town, his eyes steady, his shoulders carrying none of the weight they had placed on him. A man near the front shifted, clearing his throat as if that might bring things back to something familiar. "Well," he muttered, not loud, not confident, just enough to break the silence that had begun to turn against them. Ethan looked at him, not sharply, not with challenge, just long enough for the question to lose its edge. Then he glanced past them, toward the wide stretch of land beyond Red Hollow, where the horizon did not belong to anyone who thought it could be owned. Morning came, he said simply, his voice even, carrying no strain, no defense. It was not the answer they wanted. It was not even an answer at all. The sheriff stepped forward a half step, his boots pressing into the dirt with a weight that felt smaller than it had the day before. His eyes flicked toward the open door behind Ethan, then back again, as if trying to measure something that did not fit the shape he had prepared for. "You planning on explaining yourself?" he asked, but the authority in his voice had thinned, stretched too far to hold. Ethan did not turn around. He did not close the door behind him. He did not raise his voice. "Nothing to explain," he said, the words settling into the air like dust that did not need to be stirred. A murmur passed through the crowd, not loud, not unified, just the sound of certainty cracking in small, quiet places. Someone at the back let out a short laugh, but it died quickly, like it had realized it was alone. The man who had wagered on an hour looked down at his boots instead, scuffing the dirt as if the ground might offer a better answer than the one he had just heard. Ethan took one step forward. Not toward them, not away, just enough to shift the space between what had been expected and what now stood in its place. He did not raise his hands. He did not reach for anything. He simply stood. "She is not what you call her," he said, his tone unchanged, but the words carrying farther than they should have needed to. No one answered. Not because they agreed. Not because they understood. But because for the first time, they did not have anything ready to replace what had just been taken from them. The sheriff's gaze dropped for a brief moment, then lifted again, but whatever he had planned to say did not come. Behind Ethan, the cabin remained open, the doorway framing a space that had already proven itself without needing to be shown. Nakoma did not step out. She did not need to. Her presence did not depend on being seen anymore. The wind moved through the town slowly, brushing past hats and coats and the edges of buildings that had stood longer than most of the men gathered there, carrying with it a quiet that felt different from the one the night had held. This one was not waiting.
It was settling.
Ethan looked at them one last time, not with defiance, not with triumph, just with the kind of calm that comes from knowing something has already been decided where it matters. Then he turned, not in retreat, but in completion, and stepped back toward the open door. He did not rush. He did not pause. He crossed the threshold the same way he had the night before, by choice. The door did not close immediately. It stayed open for a moment longer, letting the light fall inside, letting the silence stretch just enough for it to be felt. Then, gently, without force, it came to rest. Out on the road, no one moved right away. No one left. No one called after him. They stood there, facing something they had not prepared for, something that did not argue, did not fight, did not demand. It had simply stayed. And in a place where men believed strength had to be loud to be real, that was the part they did not know how to answer.